When Axis soldiers first encountered American battlefield medicine, many were left speechless, not from injury, but from disbelief. They had been raised on doctrines that treated the wounded as inevitable casualties, men to be mourned or forgotten once the smoke cleared. To see American medics sprinting forward through gunfire, white armbands flapping, red crosses stark against the grime of war, was to witness something that defied every expectation. These were not rear echelon orderlies hiding behind sandbags. These were men who moved with purpose, urgency, and an almost unnatural calm. They carried no rifles, only kits, bandages, tourniquets, morphine syrettes, and they moved as if bullets had no claim on them. German infantrymen in Tunisia, Italian conscripts in Sicily, Japanese riflemen in the Solomons, all later described the same stunned reaction. One German private, captured near Kasserine Pass in early 1943, recalled lying wounded in a shallow ditch, expecting to bleed out under the North African sun. Instead, he watched as two American medics, crouched low but moving steadily, crossed open ground under sporadic machine gun fire to reach a fallen GI nearby. They applied pressure, injected morphine, dragged the man to cover, all within minutes. They did not wait for silence, he wrote in a post-war memoir. They moved as if the battle belonged to them too. This was no accident. The U.S. Army had spent the interwar years refining a doctrine that placed medical response at the heart of combat operations. Where other armies treated battlefield medicine as an afterthought, a grim cleanup once the shooting stopped, the Americans saw it as a continuation of the fight. Saving a wounded soldier wasn't charity, it was strategy. A man pulled from the field alive could return to duty. A man left to die was a permanent loss, and in a war of attrition that difference could decide everything. Training reflected this philosophy. American medics weren't drafted from the bottom of the barrel or assigned because they couldn't handle a rifle. They were volunteers, often with prior medical experience or aptitude, selected for temperament as much as skill. They trained for months, not just in anatomy and first aid, but in battlefield psychology, triage under fire, improvisation with limited tools. They learned to distinguish arterial bleeding from venous, to recognize the early signs of shock, to apply a tourniquet with one hand while dragging a man with the other. They practiced until the motions were muscle memory, until the chaos of gunfire became background noise to their mission. Axis soldiers noticed. German officers, accustomed to seeing their own stretcher-bearers hesitate or freeze under fire, marveled at the Americans' discipline. They moved like clockwork, one Wehrmacht captain wrote in his journal after witnessing a firefight near Monte Cassino. 2 men to a casualty, one stabilized, the other signaled for extraction. No shouting, no panic, as if they had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times. They had. The Red Cross armband was more than a symbol. It was a statement. American commanders believed, perhaps naively, perhaps bravely, that the conventions of war still held weight. That even in the madness of combat, an enemy soldier might pause before shooting a man clearly marked as non-combatant. Sometimes that faith was rewarded. Often it was not. Medics were targeted, especially by snipers and desperate defenders. But the visibility remained. It allowed them to move faster, to be recognized by their own troops, to operate without the burden of concealment. To Axis eyes, it looked like recklessness. To American command, it was calculated risk, the cost of speed. And speed was everything. Studies conducted after early Pacific and North African engagements showed that survival rates plummeted after the first hour of injury. A man with a sucking chest wound might live 10 minutes without intervention. A soldier bleeding from a femoral artery might last 5. The Americans built their entire system around beating that clock. Medics were embedded at the platoon level, sometimes even at the squad level in heavy combat units. Radios crackled with casualty reports. Jeeps idled at collection points. Evac helicopters, still experimental but increasingly common by 1944, stood ready on makeshift landing strips. Every minute saved meant another life preserved. This efficiency unnerved Axis troops. It suggested a level of organization they rarely saw in their own ranks. German medics, though often highly skilled, were frequently understaffed and under-equipped, especially on the Eastern Front. Italian medical units suffered from chronic supply shortages and poor transport. Japanese field hospitals were often little more than bamboo huts staffed by overworked orderlies with minimal training. To see Americans treating battlefield medicine with the precision of an assembly line, to watch a wounded man go from bullet strike to surgical table in under an hour, was to confront a different kind of warfare. There were moments of surreal humanity, too. In the chaos of retreat or sudden ceasefire, American medics sometimes treated enemy wounded, not out of sentimentality, but because the Geneva Conventions demanded it, and because, pragmatically, a stabilized prisoner was easier to transport than a corpse. Axis soldiers later recounted waking up in American aid stations, bandaged by the same hands that had been firing at them hours before. One Italian lieutenant, shot in the leg during the Anzio breakout, described his confusion upon regaining consciousness. "I expected interrogation, perhaps brutality. Instead, a young medic with tired eyes gave me water and changed my dressing without speaking. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He simply did his job." That detachment, that professionalism, was perhaps more unsettling than any act of kindness. These early encounters planted a seed in the Axis mind. The Americans did not fight like other armies. They did not accept death as inevitable. They resisted it, organized against it, poured resources into defeating it. To soldiers raised on the stoic fatalism of the Wehrmacht, the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army, or the underfunded desperation of the Italian forces, this was alien. It suggested a society that valued the individual soldier, not as a pawn, but as an asset worth preserving. That realization, more than any tank or bomber, began to erode the psychological foundation of Axis morale. If the speed of American medics shocked Axis soldiers, the sight of blood plasma transfusions left them speechless. For most German, Italian, and Japanese troops, the concept of battlefield blood replacement was either theoretical or non-existent. Blood transfusions, if they happened at all, occurred in rear-area hospitals, often days after injury, and only for officers or politically valuable personnel. Plasma, the golden liquid that could stave off shock and buy critical time, was a luxury few Axis medics had ever seen, let alone administered. The Americans treated it as standard issue. From the earliest days of the war, the U.S. government launched a massive civilian blood drive. Posters urged citizens to give the gift of life. Movie stars rolled up their sleeves in newsreels. Factories and schools hosted donation drives. The blood was processed, separated into plasma and serum, bottled, labeled, and shipped overseas in refrigerated crates. By 1943, plasma was as common in a frontline aid kit as sulfa powder or bandages. Medics carried it in insulated pouches. Field hospitals stockpiled it like ammunition. Axis prisoners were the first to witness its effects up close. German medics captured in Sicily described walking into a U.S. battalion aid station and seeing rows of wounded men hooked to IV lines, clear fluid dripping into their veins. It was like watching Lazarus rise, one recalled. Men who should have been dead, gray-faced, pulse weak, were sitting up within the hour, asking for water. The science was simple. Plasma restored blood volume, stabilized blood pressure, delayed the onset of irreversible shock. But to men accustomed to watching comrades fade from blood loss, it seemed like alchemy. The logistics alone were staggering. Plasma had to be kept cool. It had to be matched, not by blood type, since plasma was type agnostic, but by sterility and expiration date. It had to be transported across oceans, through jungles, over mountains, into foxholes. And yet the Americans made it work. Refrigerated trucks, insulated backpacks, even ice-packed crates dropped by parachute. Nothing was too elaborate if it meant keeping plasma viable. Axis supply officers, struggling to get boots and rations to their men, could only stare in disbelief. "They bring their blood with them," a captured German doctor muttered after touring a mobile surgical unit in Normandy. As if each soldier carries not just a rifle, but a vial of borrowed time. The psychological impact was profound. American soldiers knew that if they were hit, help was coming. And that help included more than just a bandage. It included a lifeline pumped directly into their veins. That knowledge changed how they fought. They took risks. They held positions longer. They charged machine gun nests with a confidence that seemed reckless to Axis observers, but was, in fact, grounded in the certainty that if they fell, they wouldn't be left to bleed out in the dirt. Axis troops noticed. German diaries from the Hurtgen forest mention the American miracle fluid with a mix of awe and bitterness. Japanese intelligence reports from Okinawa noted with alarm that wounded Americans recovered strength unnaturally fast. Even high command took notice. German medical officers were ordered to study captured American plasma kits, to reverse engineer the process, to replicate the system. They failed. The infrastructure simply didn't exist. Germany lacked the refrigerated transport, the civilian donation network, the industrial capacity to mass-produce sterile bottles and tubing. Japan, fighting a war across thousands of islands with broken supply lines, didn't even try. And then there were the moments when Axis wounded received plasma themselves. It happened more often than one might expect, when medics had surplus, when prisoners were stable enough to benefit, when the rules of war momentarily overrode the rules of combat. The reactions were uniform: disbelief, then gratitude, then a dawning horror. Horror not at the treatment, but at what it implied. If the Americans would waste such precious resources on their enemies, what must they be doing for their own? How many men were being saved, returned to duty, sent back into the fight? The math was demoralizing. A German soldier given plasma after capture in Italy later wrote, "I lived because of their medicine, and I knew as I lay there that 10 of their men had lived because of it too. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting a machine that turned blood into bullets." By war's end, the American Red Cross had shipped over 13 million pints of plasma overseas. Millions of lives were saved. Thousands of soldiers returned to combat who would have died in any other army. The Axis had no answer to it. They could match American tanks with Tigers, bombers with Stukas, infantry with fanatical charges. But they could not match a system that treated human life as a renewable resource. That, more than any weapon, signaled the true depth of America's industrial and moral advantage. If plasma was a miracle, the American Mobile Surgical Hospital was divine intervention. For Axis soldiers, the very idea of performing major surgery within earshot of artillery fire was unthinkable. In the German army, field hospitals were established miles behind the front, accessible only after hours of bumpy transport on overcrowded ambulances. In the Japanese army, surgery often meant a knife, a bottle of sake for anesthesia, and a prayer. The notion that a man could be shot in the abdomen at dawn and be on the operating table by noon, under electric lights, with sterile instruments and trained nurses, was beyond comprehension. The Americans made it routine. The Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, later immortalized as MASH, wasn't just a tent with a table. It was a fully functional operating theater packed into trucks and trailers, designed to deploy within hours and treat hundreds of casualties a day. Surgeons, anesthesiologists, nurses, and orderlies traveled with the front lines, setting up in orchards, abandoned barns, even bombed-out churches. Generators hummed, lanterns glowed, steam sterilizers hissed. And while shells whistled overhead, men in khaki scrubbed their hands and bent over wounded soldiers with the focus of men in a peacetime hospital. Axis prisoners who stumbled into these facilities, whether as captives or in rare cases as patients, were uniformly stunned. One German paratrooper, wounded near Carentan, described being carried into a U.S. field hospital still wearing his jump smock. "I expected a barn, straw on the floor, a surgeon with blood on his boots," he recalled. "Instead, I saw white sheets, metal trays, a nurse adjusting an IV. The surgeon asked me my name before he asked where I was hit." The level of care was clinical, impersonal, efficient, and utterly alien to a man raised on the brutal pragmatism of the Eastern Front. The speed was what unnerved them most. In the German system, a soldier with a ruptured spleen might wait 6 hours for surgery, if he survived the journey. In the American system, he was cut open within 90 minutes of injury. That difference was measured in lives. Studies later showed that abdominal wounds, almost universally fatal in 1918, had a 50% survival rate in U.S. mobile hospitals by 1944. For chest wounds, the rate was even higher. Axis surgeons, when they had the chance to observe, were awestruck. They operate as if time is their enemy, one captured Italian doctor wrote, and they are winning. The mobility was equally impressive. When the front moved, the hospitals moved with it. Tents were struck, instruments packed, generators loaded onto trucks, all within hours. Axis reconnaissance units sometimes found abandoned surgical sites, empty but for tire tracks and discarded plasma bottles. The efficiency was chilling. It suggested an army that could heal as fast as it advanced, that treated medical infrastructure with the same strategic importance as fuel depots or artillery batteries. For Japanese soldiers, the contrast was especially stark. On islands like Guadalcanal or Peleliu, wounded men often died waiting for evacuation that never came. Medical supplies ran out. Doctors performed amputations with carpenter's saws. Morphine was a myth. To hear rumors, or worse, to witness firsthand, of Americans conducting blood transfusions and bowel resections under canvas tents while naval gunfire shook the ground, it was enough to break a man's spirit. They do not accept death, a captured Japanese medic confessed after the fall of Saipan. They fight it with scalpels and tubes and machines, and they win. The psychological toll on Axis troops was cumulative. Every story of a comrade saved by American surgeons, every rumor of men returning to duty after hopeless wounds, every glimpse of a mobile hospital glowing in the dusk, it all added up to a single demoralizing conclusion. The Americans had removed death from the equation. Or at least, they had pushed it back, again and again, with science and steel and stubbornness. Where Axis doctrine preached sacrifice, American doctrine promised survival. And in the grinding meat grinder of modern war, that promise was more powerful than any speech, any medal, any flag. Saving a man's life on the battlefield meant nothing if you couldn't get him to safety. The Americans understood this better than anyone. While Axis armies relied on horse-drawn carts, commandeered farm wagons, or, if they were lucky, overloaded trucks to move their wounded, the U.S. Army built an evacuation network so efficient it bordered on the miraculous. It began at the point of injury. Medics stabilized the wounded, then handed them off to litter teams, soldiers trained specifically to carry stretchers over rough terrain. From there, casualties moved to battalion aid stations, then to collecting points where specially modified jeeps waited. These weren't the standard reconnaissance vehicles Axis troops knew. These were ambulances in all but name, reinforced suspensions, stretcher racks mounted in the rear, red crosses painted boldly on hood and doors. They could carry 2 lying patients or 4 sitting, and they could navigate shell-cratered roads that would break an ordinary truck's axles. German officers, used to seeing their own wounded piled into the backs of half-tracks or left by the roadside until a lull in fighting, could scarcely believe their eyes. They treat their injured like royalty, one Wehrmacht major wrote, after observing an American evacuation near Aachen. Jeeps painted like hospital wagons, drivers who do not speed but do not hesitate, medics who ride alongside checking pulses. It is obscene in its efficiency. But the jeeps were only the first link. From collecting points, casualties moved to larger ambulances, 6-wheeled trucks with padded interiors, oxygen tanks, and sometimes even onboard generators for lighting and medical equipment. These vehicles carried men to field hospitals often miles behind the front, but still close enough that the wounded arrived within the golden hour, the critical window for trauma survival. Axis prisoners who rode in them described the experience with near religious awe. No jolting, one Italian soldier recalled. Blankets, water, a medic who held my hand when I cried. I had expected to die in the dust. Instead, I slept. And then there were the planes. Air evacuation was America's masterstroke. While other nations dabbled in medical flights, the U.S. made it a cornerstone of their medical doctrine. From North Africa to New Guinea, from Normandy to Okinawa, American cargo planes, stripped of weapons, fitted with stretcher racks, staffed by flight nurses and airborne medics, lifted wounded men out of hell and into safety. Sometimes within hours of injury, a soldier would be airborne, heading for a hospital ship or a rear area facility with real beds and hot meals. Axis troops who experienced this, usually as prisoners, were shattered by the experience. "I woke up in the sky," one German lieutenant wrote after being evacuated from the Falaise pocket. "Beneath me, the battlefield burned. Above me, a nurse adjusted my IV. I asked if I was dead. She laughed and said, 'Not today.'" The logistics were staggering. Radio coordination between frontline medics and airfields, pre-positioned aircraft, flight paths cleared of enemy fighters, landing strips carved out of forests or rice paddies. It was a ballet of precision that Axis forces, struggling to feed their own troops, could not begin to replicate. The morale impact was incalculable. American soldiers knew that if they were hit, they wouldn't rot in a ditch. They'd be on a jeep within minutes, in a truck within the hour, on a plane before nightfall. That knowledge let them fight harder, take more risks, hold the line longer. Axis soldiers, by contrast, fought with the gnawing certainty that a serious wound meant agony, abandonment, or death. Captured diaries are filled with bitter comparisons. They fly their wounded away like mail. Ours wait for God. By 1945, the system was so refined that men with abdominal wounds, once a guaranteed death sentence, were surviving at rates that would have been science fiction in 1939. The combination of rapid ground evacuation, mobile surgical hospitals, and air transport created a feedback loop of resilience. Wounded men lived. They recovered. They returned to duty. The Army grew stronger, not weaker, with each battle. Axis commanders watched in horror as casualty reports showed American units absorbing horrific losses, then reconstituting themselves within weeks. "They do not bleed out," a Japanese general reportedly said after Okinawa. "They bleed, and then they heal. And then they come again." For men raised in armies where pain was a sacrament, endured silently, stoically as proof of courage, the American approach to battlefield suffering was heresy. Why silence a man's screams with morphine? Why waste precious drugs on a soldier who might die anyway? Pain was part of war. To remove it was to weaken the warrior spirit. The Americans disagreed. Morphine syrettes, small disposable tubes with a needle attached, were standard issue for U.S. medics. They hung from bandoliers, ready to be plunged into a thigh or shoulder within seconds of injury. A man writhing in shock from a gut wound could be calm, coherent, even smiling within minutes. To Axis soldiers, this was sorcery. German medics, who often hoarded morphine for officers or the salvageable, watched in disbelief as American corpsmen injected it into privates, into prisoners, into men with wounds that seemed hopeless. "They carry mercy in their pockets," one captured Wehrmacht doctor wrote, "and they dispense it like candy." But morphine was only the beginning. Penicillin, the war's true medical revolution, hit the front lines in 1943, and its impact was apocalyptic. Infections that had killed men for centuries, gangrene, sepsis, tetanus, were halted with a few injections. A soldier with a festering shrapnel wound in his leg who in 1918 would have lost the limb, or his life to infection, now walked again. Axis doctors, when they got their hands on captured penicillin, studied it like holy relics. "This changes everything," a Japanese surgeon scrawled in his notebook after treating a prisoner with American-supplied penicillin. "We are fighting men who cannot die from the wounds that kill ours." The scale of production was incomprehensible to Axis minds. While Germany struggled to synthesize small batches of antibiotics in bombed-out labs, the U.S. was flooding the front with millions of doses. Factories churned it out. Nurses carried it in refrigerated cases. Medics injected it without hesitation. It wasn't rationed, it wasn't reserved. It was as common as rifle grease. Stories spread among Axis troops like folklore. Men who should have died walked again. Wounds that should have festered healed clean. Prisoners treated with penicillin wept with gratitude, and then, quietly, with despair. "If they give this to us, One German soldier whispered after receiving an injection in a POW hospital. What do they give to their own? The answer was obvious. More. Always more. The psychological effect was devastating. American soldiers fought without fear of infection, without fear of lingering, screaming death from a minor scratch. They trusted their medics, their medicine, their system. Axis soldiers fought with the shadow of agony hanging over every wound. A nick from a bayonet could mean weeks of fever and delirium. A bullet graze could rot a limb off. The difference wasn't just medical. It was existential. What held this entire system together wasn't technology or logistics. It was people. Specifically, American medics. Disciplined, trained, relentless, and utterly fearless. Axis armies often treated their medical personnel as afterthoughts. Stretcher bearers were chosen from the least fit, the least reliable, the ones who couldn't march or shoot straight. They received minimal training. They carried no weapons. They were expected to wait for lulls in fighting, to scavenge bandages, to do the best they could with what they had. American medics were different. They were specialists. They trained for months. They studied anatomy, pharmacology, battlefield psychology. They drilled until they could apply a tourniquet blindfolded, until they could tell shock from hysteria at a glance, until they could improvise a splint from a rifle and a bayonet. They moved in teams, with roles as defined as any infantry squad. One to stabilize, one to monitor, one to evacuate. They didn't wait for silence. They moved under fire because silence was a luxury war didn't allow. German officers, used to seeing their own medics cower in trenches, were awestruck. They walked through bullets like priests through crowds, one wrote after Anzio. No hesitation, no fear, only purpose. Japanese soldiers raised on the cult of the warrior's death found it incomprehensible. Why risk so much for one life? A captured sergeant asked after watching an American medic drag a wounded man through a minefield. The answer, to the Americans, was simple. Because every life was worth it. Their discipline extended beyond training. They followed a code. Red Cross armbands were worn with pride. Weapons were carried only as a last resort. Enemy wounded were treated when possible. Not out of kindness, but because the rules of war demanded it, and because a live prisoner was easier to handle than a corpse. Stories circulated of medics treating Germans who had shot at them minutes earlier, of sharing morphine with Italians who had ambushed their platoon. To Axis soldiers, this wasn't just professionalism. It was a different morality, and it worked. American soldiers trusted their medics absolutely. Letters home called them angels in helmet liners. Diaries described them as the bravest men in the company. That trust translated into morale, into resilience, into a willingness to fight harder because you knew if you fell, someone would come for you. Someone trained, someone equipped, someone who wouldn't leave you behind. Axis troops had no such assurance. Their stretcher bearers were often overwhelmed, undertrained, terrified. Wounded men lay for hours, sometimes days, waiting for help that might never come. The difference wasn't just in survival rates. It was in the soul of the army. The Americans had built a machine that valued the individual. The Axis had built machines that consumed them. By 1944, the numbers were undeniable. American soldiers were surviving wounds that would have killed their Axis counterparts 10 times over. A German with a chest wound had a 30% chance of living. An American, 70%. A Japanese soldier with an abdominal injury? Less than 10%, an American over 50%. The gap wasn't luck, it was system. Axis officers watched in horror as casualty reports showed American units absorbing horrific losses, then returning to full strength within weeks. Men came back from the dead? Not literally, but close enough. A soldier shot through the lung in June was back on the line in August. A man who lost a leg in Normandy was training recruits by Christmas. To Axis troops, it seemed like fighting ghosts. They do not stay dead. A German private muttered after seeing a GI he'd personally shot return to his unit 3 weeks later. What kind of army is this? The answer was an army that had turned medicine into a weapon. Not a weapon of destruction, but of preservation, of resilience, of morale. Every saved soldier was a blow to the Axis strategy of attrition. Every man who returned to duty was a testament to American industrial might, medical innovation, and, perhaps most terrifying of all, compassion. By 1945, the psychological weight of this system crushed Axis morale. Soldiers whispered that the Americans had conquered death. Officers wrote in despair that no amount of bravery could overcome an enemy that refused to stay fallen. The war wasn't just being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost in the aid stations, the operating tents, the evacuation planes. The Americans hadn't just outgunned them, they had out-healed them. And in the end, that was what broke the Axis spirit. Not the bombs, not the tanks, not the numbers, but the quiet, relentless, scientifically precise refusal to let their men die. It was a new kind of warfare, and the Axis had no answer for it. When the war ended, Axis soldiers carried home more than memories of defeat. They carried stories of medics who walked through fire, of plasma that reversed death, of surgeons who operated under shell fire, of planes that carried the wounded to heaven. These stories weren't exaggerations, they were observations, testimonies, confessions of awe. The Americans had done something unprecedented. They had turned battlefield medicine into a strategic weapon, not by making war less deadly, but by making survival more certain. They had built a system so vast, so efficient, so deeply integrated into their combat doctrine, that it reshaped the psychology of war itself. Soldiers fought differently because they knew they would be saved. Commanders planned differently because they knew their men would return. The army didn't shrink with casualties. It regenerated. To the Axis, this was incomprehensible. War was supposed to be a grinder, a meat mill, a test of endurance where the side that could suffer more would win. The Americans had rejected that logic. They had said, no, every man matters. Every life can be saved. And they had poured the full force of their industry, their science, their national will into proving it. In the end, that was their greatest weapon. Not the Sherman tank, not the B-17, not the atomic bomb, but the medic with a Surette, the nurse on a cargo plane, the surgeon in a muddy tent. The quiet, relentless machinery of mercy that refused to let death have the final word. And that, more than anything, is why they won.